members of the Turkish Academy of Management, dear guests, today we have a highly distinguished guest speaker, Professor Peter Allen Bamberger, the president of the Academy of Management, is with us. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
As the Turkish Academy of Management, we'd like to express our heartfelt thanks for the support you have been giving us. In fact, this will be the third time Professor Bamberger is addressing our community. The first two were keynote speeches made at Istanbul in our Academy's yearly meeting in September 2024. Before giving the floor to our guest speaker, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to introduce him to you all with a brief biography. Professor Bamberger took his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from Cornell University. Besides those at Cornell, he has taken research and teaching positions in Israel, France, Canada, Australia, Singapore, and China. He has numerous publications on individual and group behavior in organizations and human resources, majority of which are published in high-impact journals, such as the Journal of Applied Psychology, Academy of Management Journal, and Human Relations. Currently, he is affiliated with Tel Aviv University and is a distinguished visiting professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. Professor Bamberger's research interests are compensation and pay communication, cognitive implications of discrete workplace events such as incivility, gratitude, peer relations in the workplace, and counterproductive work behaviors and emotional well-being of employees. Dear guests, Peter will be taking your questions and comments both during and after his speech. Peter Hocam, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I will share my screen. And while I'm doing that, let me just say thanks once again for hosting me and giving us the opportunity at the Academy to play a role in the development of the science in Turkey. The experience has been incredible, and the progress equally incredible. The way the Turkish Academy is growing. So we're thrilled to have the Turkish Academy as part of the growing family of all these academies of management around the world. So what I'm going to be speaking with you about today is really at the heart of what we do as scholars. We publish. In fact, if we don't publish, the saying goes, we perish. So the trick is, how do we avoid perishing? And more importantly, how do we use publishing as a means by which to have impact and relevance in the broader communities in which we operate? So I'm going to be talking mostly about framing and positioning a paper, in particular in top-tier journals. So I'm going to be focusing on the Academy of Management journals, but there are plenty of other top management journals that are not Academy journals. And I think what I'm going to be presenting is relevant to most of those journals as well. And I'm also going to be focusing largely on conventional papers that are written more in the framework of deductive reasoning. But I will also make some reference, particularly at the end of the talk, to papers that are grounded on inductive reasoning and even the least conventional, but hopefully growing trend of research that's abductive in nature. So with that in mind, let me just first kind of give you a framework of the different Academy journals that are out there and how they fit into this picture of the different types of publications we might have. So these are the various Academy journals that you may be considering submitting your papers to. And you can see the Web of Science impact factors. This is from 2024 impact factors. So we're talking about 7 different Academy publications. And one way to think about them is in terms of their role in the knowledge production process. Another way to think about them, and I'll make reference to that as well, is in terms of the process of of scientific or theoretical development. But let's start off with knowledge production. So we can think of knowledge production, and by the way, this is from a joint from the editor's piece that was published earlier this academic year by all of the editors of the various academy journals together. And I think it really does give a good framework for understanding the portfolio of the academy journals, and even more broadly, the portfolio of journals in the field of management more generally. So if we start at the upper, well, let's start at the middle right, where with Academy of Management Discoveries, because I want to use this kind of framework as a way of talking not only about knowledge production, but also about theory development. So if you think about the way we do theory development, a lot of it is grounded on prior research and sitting kind of in our ivory towers and just thinking about ideas, right? And writing theory. But increasingly, there's a recognition that theory in management should be developed the same way that theory is developed in other scientific disciplines, which is to ground the theory on observed phenomena, on patterns we see out there. So using empirical observation as a way of developing potential ideas, a plausible basis for the way things work, for theory. So if that's what largely we do in journals like Academy of Management Discoveries, and again, Discoveries is focused strictly on that, but there are lots of other journals that are now publishing this type of research, which is more abductive in nature. And again, I'll get to that notion of abduction later on in my talk. But the general principle is looking at a specific pattern, having a hunch that that pattern is generalizable and is the basis for a theory that we need to develop further. That theory may then be developed further in a paper that we might publish in Academy of Management Review, where we build on the basic parameters that we have seen set out in a Discoveries article, where we understand the boundary conditions and perhaps the basic relationships between different constructs that are kind of hinted at or picked up at empirically in Discoveries. And we develop this further into a broad model or a broad theory or a specific model, right? Then the next step would be to actually test some of those propositions that are developed in an Academy of Management Review article by operationalizing them and extending a little bit that theory further in an Academy of Management Journal article. So you can see that we're going from more abductive, inductive reasoning into deductive reasoning in theory generation and then theory testing. What happens after that is hopefully we have a lot of studies on the same main ideas, and there's an important role to play in terms of synthesizing these empirical findings. And the Academy publishes several papers several journals that play this role in synthesis. To some degree, there's synthesis that's conducted in an Academy of Management Review article, annals papers, similar to what you might find in Journal of Management review papers, and a lot of journals publish review papers or any of the annual reviews. These are synthesis types of publications. Collections is a publication that you don't really submit to. It's more of a republication outlet for the Academy, where we have a curator assigned to focus on a particular topic and then pulls in articles that have already been published in Academy journals. So this is the synthesis part. A lot of the findings that we present have an important role to play in educating future management managers and thought leaders. This moves us into the area of education, and we have a journal that does a lot of that work, Academy of Management Learning and Education. And of course, a lot of the work that we do has implications for practitioners. And that moves us into the area of application. And for that, we have Academy of Management Perspectives, which aims to take evidence-based research and make that accessible to people in the field. So that gives you kind of a portfolio of the different journals that the Academy publishes and that you may want to be thinking about in submitting your work. So if you're thinking about submitting your work and you're thinking about submitting it to an empirical journal like Academy of Management Journal, but even to Academy of Management Review, if it's a theoretical piece, some of this is still relevant. The framing is really critical, right? This is like going out on a date and trying to put your best foot forward because first impressions matter. And first impressions matter a lot for reviewers as well when they're looking at your paper. Adam Grant said it really well when he wrote, as you can see in the slide, if reviewers are intrigued by the research question, appreciate its importance, and understand how the study advances understanding of the topic, they're more likely to look for reasons to recommend revision. One of the things to think about when you submit your paper, or when you're writing your paper, actually, is that the reviewers are often looking at your paper in perhaps not the best context. A lot of reviewers actually review papers on airplanes, for example. Hopefully they're not watching a movie while they're doing it. But this is airplane work for a lot of scholars. And in that kind of context, it's important to get their attention and to get it fast. It's kind of like if you're writing a novel, you need to get the attention of your reader quickly and to get them engaged very, very quickly. So there are a couple of tricks here in terms of the different hoops that you have to jump through to get them on board with what you're doing. One of them is that you need to make sure that they view your research as interesting and important. And one of the best ways to do this, and when you're writing the introduction to your paper, is to use the words interesting and important, like to say, this is important because, right? Don't hide it, put it clearly out front, what the importance is, how it's timely, how it's relevant to certain types of things that are going on in the business environment, how there's been debate, how a certain topic is controversial, and this is actually shifting the conversation. It's a paradigm shifting finding that you're about to present. The other element here is that you need to make this interesting. So you need to somehow couch the topic that you're addressing in a manner that makes it surprising. There's something interesting and surprising there. It's not intuitive, right? It's not common sense. We're going against conventional wisdom. This is something that actually is worth looking at because it's not what we expect, okay? A final thing in terms of that interesting and important is to position the framework that you're presenting in the most robust way. So certainly, if you can argue that what you're presenting is an overarching theory, that's really important, right? Like it's prospect theory. Doesn't necessarily have to be a Nobel Prize winning theory, but a broad framework is certainly more important than a model explaining how a certain phenomenon emerges over time, okay? And there's a difference clearly between the grand theories and those very, very specific models. So the more you can somehow position your contribution less as a model and more towards a new theoretical perspective, the more important it's likely to be viewed. Second important hoop is that you clearly understand the literature and that you're able to position your contribution within that literature. So this is that notion of joining a conversation and linking back to that conversation. The way I often explain it is, think about going to a cocktail party and there are a bunch of people talking and you hear a couple of critical words and you start to contribute something to that conversation and everybody looks at you like you've just landed from Mars, right? Because you're saying the obvious. You don't want to be in that situation when you write a paper. You want to be familiar with the conversation. You want to understand what's being said before you open up your mouth, okay? And you want to make sure that you at least start within the framework of the existing conversation. You can go far beyond that, and you should go far beyond that following it, but you need to start within what we know in that conversation. The third important troop that you have to jump through is that you have to make sense, right? You have to provide a simple and parsimonious explanation for what you're doing. It can't have too many logical elements because that may be very difficult for the reader to follow. You need to keep it easy to follow. If you can give your argument in 3 simple steps, that's somehow the way our brains typically work. 3 elements, right? Maybe 4. But certainly you don't want to jump from one element of the argument to the other. You want it to be, your argument to be very, very easy to follow, how you're going from one step in the logical framework that you're presenting to the next step, right? So think about it as a whole series of if-thens, and each of those if-thens has to follow from the previous one without any leaps. You want it to be as parsimonious as possible. I mean, that's the key to science. In terms of parsimony, think about, Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity. 3 variables, okay? If only we could do that in social science, explain the universe with 3 variables. So think about trying to couch your model or theoretical framework in some broader overarching theory. At most, 2 complementary perspectives that can fill in the holes in the other. And think about trying to get the biggest bang for the buck. In other words, the highest amount of variance explained with the fewest number of variables. Because your perspective is actually telling you which variables, which constructs you need to focus on. And all the rest is small change. You really don't have to focus on that too much, right? That's the bang for the buck. So in the pitch, there are a couple of things that we're looking for, and I've mentioned some of these things already. There's an article that appeared years ago by Davis called "That's Interesting," which talks about what it is in scholarly research that people find interesting. What do we do when we write a paper that kind of communicates something that's non-intuitive and surprising, right? So this is worthwhile. This is an article worthwhile looking at. It's an old article, but it's just as relevant today as when it was written. So surprise, unexpectedness, this non-intuitive element is really important. The parsimony and simplicity of the model, the more simple and straightforward the model is, the better it is. I mean, if you look at Nobel Prize winning theories like prospect theory or like human capital theory, sometimes I tell my students, like, how could you win a Nobel Prize for proposing something so simple, right? It's so kind of almost like obvious, right? So few parts, such a simple explanation. But this is really what it's all about. You want that counterintuitive angle that's still relatively simple to understand to have that impact. It's got to be credible. You've got to understand it, which logic is important for that. And the last part is we're all affected by emotion. A lot of us do research on emotions. So to the degree that you can tell a story in the beginning of your paper, it often drives home the point that you're trying to get across in whatever it is that you're studying. So there are a couple of papers that do this. Gail Whiteman, who's an organizational ethnographer, does a lot of work in sustainability, wrote a paper on environmental awareness of managers. And I was the action editor, Academy of Management Journal, when she submitted this paper. And I'm still whipping myself or feeling very, very guilty for what I did to her and this paper as a typical action editor before I understood really what I was doing. The first 5 pages of this paper that she submitted, she was literally telling a story of how she almost died when she was exploring the Arctic, being led around by an indigenous guide. And it was a page turner. Like, I was reading this article and I couldn't stop the first 5 pages. She had me completely engaged. And what did I do as an associate editor? I said, this is fascinating. You could write a novel like this, but this is not scholarly writing. Get rid of that and give us the conventional introduction. What a mistake. I mean, we accepted the paper. It's a really important paper. It's called Ecological Sense Making. That's the name of the paper if you want to look at it. But you won't see that story there because I forced her to take it out. But that type of story is actually really, really effective. And in my own work, I often use that kind of story. So you see in the slide, Morris Earhart. Morris Earhart was a Bank of America intern doing his MBA who worked 3 days and 3 nights nonstop, and on the 4th day was found dead in the elevator of his office building at the Bank of America. What a great way to start a study looking at organizational identity or the dark side of commitment, right? When it goes a little bit too far. I mean, it's sad, obviously. It's not a wonderful story to talk about, but it is driving home the point, and it makes the whole argument very, very clear. It's an illustrative kind of an experience that you can take the reader through. You can use an illustrative quote. Sometimes that does the same thing. You can talk about how prevalent a problem is. For example, I do a lot of work on the dark side of people, right? On people's drinking behavior. I'm now doing a study looking at the transition from prison to the workplace. And a remarkable statistic that I discovered, I couldn't believe it at first, but it's over a quarter of Americans have a history of incarceration. So on the one hand, you think about, okay, this is a small topic. It's not really relevant. How many prisoners are there that end up going into the workplace? But when you look at the numbers, it's like I said, a quarter of Americans have this history. You can be sure that when I actually finish the study and start writing up my results, I am going to be starting most of my papers with this statistic because I want to drive home the point that this is something that we haven't paid attention to and that we need to pay attention to because a lot of the people that we interact with in the workplace at one point in their lives spend some time behind bars, in the US at least. Another way to do it is to document trends about health, trends about various workplace issues. So these are all ways of getting your reader engaged. Other things that we need to be focusing on to get the reader engaged is sort of navigating this gap between the practical and the abstract, okay? We are scholars. We need to have external validity, sort of generalizability of whatever it is that we're looking at. What that means is that whatever practical issue or problem that we're actually studying has to have some relevance to some bigger topic in order for it to have broad scale interest. And when you submit to an academy journal or a top tier journal, most of these journals are what we call big tent journals. In other words, they publish the best of studies in a wide range of topics. So even though I might focus on HR or in compensation research, I'm still reading most of those articles that are published on strategy, on entrepreneurship, on various macro topics in Academy of Management Journal. Why? Because these are the most important papers in our field, and they have relevance somehow to almost everybody. One little element. The trick when you write for these journals is to somehow link your particular niche topic to something bigger. So you want to find that broader conversation at a higher level of abstraction and link back to it. So going back to Morris Earhart, this notion of personal self-sacrifice, which I can actually capture empirically. What is that? What's the broader topic that really relates to? The broader topic that relates to that a lot of people, both at the micro and at the macro level, are looking at is the topic of identity, how organizations build a sense of identity, how they establish and generate commitment on the part of their workforce. Self-sacrifice is perhaps one small element of that, and I can aggregate up to it, or sort of not aggregate, I can abstract up to it. And by doing so, I'm bringing in a lot of other readers that wouldn't necessarily be so interested in like a Morris Earhart kind of case. I also have to be very, very clear about the problem that I'm addressing. So often you'll hear, and most of you have probably heard, how you need to identify a particular gap and then show how you're filling the gap, okay? And this is problematizing whatever it is that you're studying. There's a gap, there's a problem. We don't know something about something. Typically, that is not sufficient to get published in a top-tier journal, right? Often a reviewer will come back and say, okay, you're engaging in gap spotting, finding a gap and trying to fill it. What's really important is to clarify for the reader why that gap is important, what problem is created by our lack of understanding, and how efforts in the past and different theoretical approaches in the past have been unsuccessful in resolving those types of problems. So we can talk about the gap in a couple of ways. We can talk about how there are divergent findings. There's this puzzle that needs to be resolved, kind of like this incompleteness theoretically. Inadequacy that up till now, the theories that we have solve some of the problems. Really critical paradoxes or anomalies remain. Or third, that the theoretical frameworks that we have to deal with this problem, this gap, are generating findings that are just wrong. And we can demonstrate that for one reason or another, what they've been suggesting is just not right. It's inaccurate. And what the implication, again, why is it a problem? Why is that gap important to study? Simply to say you're filling a gap is not going to get you in a top-tier journal. So after you've done all of this, towards the end of your introduction, you're going to be providing a summary, which I'll talk about in a second, of what you just said. But most important towards the end of that introduction, that pitch, is clarifying your contribution. Because I would say upwards of 80–90% of papers that are rejected from top-tier journals are rejected because of an inadequate contribution. And often as an author, you'll get back the reviews and you'll say to yourself, what do you mean there's no contribution? I made a contribution. The reviewer is stupid. They didn't see it. So that's the wrong approach. The right approach is to say, I had a big contribution and I didn't express it clearly enough for the reviewer as a sample reader to understand. It's not on the reviewer to understand, it's on you as the author to clarify that contribution already in the introduction. Because if you don't do it in the introduction, the reviewer probably will go through. You've already lost. That paper is not going to go anywhere in that journal, right? So you need to clearly state how our understanding of management and organization, or at least the domain that your study is focused on, is going to be fundamentally changed or challenged by what you're doing. And it can't go in a million directions. Your contribution has to be really focused. At most, you want to talk about 3 sub-elements. I'm sorry, I keep on going back to that rule of 3, but typically when we talk about persuasion, and this is an element of sales or persuasion here, right? You're trying to persuade the reviewer to give you a revise and resubmit. When we talk about persuasion, we're limited to that rule of 3. So what is the main overarching contribution? How do we see it in which 3 elements, right? And we can talk about how it pushes the literature in a different direction. We can talk about how it resolves a certain dispute. Bottom line, if we look at Hollenbeck's types of theoretical contributions, and typically in top-tier journals, we're looking for theoretical and not simply empirical contributions, right? The trick is to have an impact on frameworks for understanding relationships and not just for showing a new way by which to study something, right? So Hollenbeck comes up with 2 main ways of contributing to theory. One is by shifting consensus. In other words, looking at widely held assumptions and saying, you know what? I don't buy these assumptions. There's a different perspective, theoretical perspective, that would challenge these assumptions. And by taking this other literature, this other perspective, we can perhaps shift the entire approach to the study of whatever it is that we're looking at and present a whole new set of ways of understanding how something emerges or how something affects other outcomes. Another type of contribution that we can make is not shifting consensus, but creating consensus. And this is what we often do when we say, look, there's, if I look at the literature, for example, the literature on the impact of retirement on drinking behavior, right? How does retiring impact people's drinking behavior? And when I did a study like this, what I noticed is that a third of the studies said if you retire, you're going to drink more because happy hour starts at noon. A third of the studies said when you retire, you're going to drink less because typically you drink because of the stresses at work. And now you're not working anymore, no more stresses, no need to drink. And a third of the studies find no relationship whatsoever, right? Or you can look at the literature on the impact of performance feedback on future performance, the famous Denisian Kluger study. And again, it's a third positive effect, a third negative effect, a third null. What do we do with that? Okay, so major papers with an important theoretical contribution say, okay, I can explain when we get the positive effect, when we get the negative effect, and when we don't get any effect at all, right? That is a major contribution. It's not shifting the consensus, but it's kind of creating consensus, right? How can we resolve these inconsistencies in the findings? So your final summary at the end of the pitch should actually do all of this stuff. Position the question, highlight clearly what that question is, why that question is important, how your approach is novel, different, unique, and can potentially offer a contribution that up till this point we haven't been able to get. And then pinpoint those 2 or 3 critical elements of the contribution that you're making. Okay? Any questions up till this point? You can, if you think about them as I start going again, questions, you can send them by chat and, I'll be interrupted and I'll go back and I'll fix some of this stuff. Cenk, you have a question?
Yeah, sure, sir. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. So I want to ask you that whether it's required to have a co-author from United States or UK to publish your research or theoretical paper in academic journals?
US or UK?
Yeah.
I don't know why you would say US or UK. I typically go for co-authors from China, personally.
I'm telling you this because we have a scholar, he conducted research and found that most of the papers published in academic journals have a co-authorship with UK or United States universities.
I think that's changing. I think there was an interesting from the editor's piece that Mark Gruber just published in Academy of Management Journal. I think it's out. You can already read it, where he talks about he looks at all the data of submissions to Academy of Management Journal, and there's actually a beautiful map there that shows where the submissions are coming from and where they're getting accepted from. And from what I remember, it's showing a dynamic, and that dynamic is changing. Increasingly, we're seeing papers authored by non-Americans, certainly by non-Brits, and we're becoming a much more heterogeneous community of scholars. And increasingly, we're seeing scholars from various countries working together. So I think it's great to work on papers with co-authors from countries other than your own. I think if you're a junior scholar, there's a real advantage to working with a senior scholar that you can learn from, that can mentor you as you write the paper. And I think that's more important than looking at where that person is coming from. So you can find highly well-published co-authors to work with from a variety of different countries. that hopefully can mentor you as you go. If you're a junior author and you haven't had success up till this point, getting into those top tier journals, find someone that has had some success, that's working in your area. If you have a really interesting data set or a unique idea, those people are going to be willing to work with you. I mean, that's what happened to me working with Chinese scholars already 20 years ago. They had great ideas, they had great access to data, and I would say probably around at least 50% of the papers that I've been working on in the past 20 years have been with Chinese co-authors, or at least one Chinese co-author.
It's a great answer. So our members can reach to various countries such as North African countries, Middle East countries, Central Asian countries for data collection. So they can access to other scholars in the network by using Turkish Academy of Management and Academy of Management connection. That's great.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful comment, Cenk. I think one way to get started if you're a junior author is to link unique data that you have access to with an interesting idea. The unique data by itself is not enough, right? If you want to look at the relationship between pay and job satisfaction, in Uzbekistan, I'm going to say, maybe, okay? But that's not going to get me very far.
About a unique organizational form or unique way of conducting business in these countries.
Exactly. There's got to be some idea there that's different and that offers new insights that we can't really see unless we have the data that you're able to provide as well. Okay, but just a really good idea is perhaps sufficient. Then you and whoever you're working with from another country can come up with a way, some way of collecting the data. It doesn't have to be in Uzbekistan. It can be in North America. It can be in Europe, right? So either that really interesting idea or the access to data with that idea is going to be helpful.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yep. So a couple of things to look out for, and you can kind of do, use this as a checklist when you're writing that initial part of the pitch. You want to make sure that people understand your motivation for doing this research, that problematization element. You want to make sure that you're defining all of your key terms, especially your constructs, the first time you're mentioning them, that everybody knows what you're talking about. You don't want to bring in any concepts or constructs into your pitch, into that initial element that you're not going to be dealing with later on, other than to say that people have looked at this in the past and it doesn't really help us very much, and then dismiss those, right? You don't want to use a passive voice, right? When you want to write with an active voice. ChatGPT can help you with this. It's perfectly legitimate as long as you disclose that you're using large language models to help you with the editing. Perfectly legitimate to use a large language model like ChatGPT to help you with the editing instead of giving it to a human editor. Okay, so if English is not your first language, save your money, use ChatGPT. Just make sure that when you submit, you disclose that you use ChatGPT to assist you with your editing. And it will remove, most likely, the passive voice. And if it doesn't do it effectively, you can ask it to rewrite it again to remove the passive voice. It's kind of weird, but it has a big effect when we read that something like, it has been found that, rather than saying, scholars find that, or research indicates that. Okay? It adversely affects our engagement as readers. I said problematize, highlight the question that you want to answer. Don't give us a million questions. Focus on one main question that may have perhaps 2 or 3 elements. Do not leverage a different theory for each hypothesis. As I mentioned early on, what's really critical is to try to provide a parsimonious answer to the question that you're raising. That parsimonious answer, that model, should be couched in one perspective, one overarching theory that allows you to isolate the critical constructs that you're going to be looking at, those critical independent variables that you want to look at, and explain why those variables are impacting the outcome that you're concerned with. It allows you to make your arguments in a much more clear and simple manner by, first of all, specifying the broad proposition underlying that overarching theory. And then you just come back to that overarching proposition a variety of times for each element of the model, for each hypothesis in the model that you're proposing. Okay, there are a couple of other elements. Now we're moving from that initial pitch to the theoretical framework, writing the theory behind your paper. And this, again, is within in a deductive framework. I will make sure someone has to ask me, but I'll forward these slides to whomever wants so that all of you can see it, because I'm never going to get through all of them. But important in this theoretical element is that you make clear what those constructs are that are at the core of the model, where they're coming from this broader theoretical perspective, that you define the constructs clearly and in a way that's consistent with the way that you operationalize them later. One of the things that I highly recommend that you do is look at the operationalization of your variables in the empirical data that you have, right? Look at the scales that you use, for example, and then use some of those words from the scales in the definition of the construct in the theory section. That way, you don't have a disconnect between your theory and your operationalizations. Such a disconnect is a fatal flaw. You theorize one thing, and then you're using measures that capture something entirely different. So if you can use the words in your measures in your conceptualization of the core constructs, you're not going to have that problem. Make sure that you use those concepts in a consistent manner. You know, Jen raised the issue about co-authors. One of the problems of having co-authors is that sometimes we have different co-authors writing different parts of the paper. And that's almost like having two novelists writing one novel, right? So imagine the beginning of the novel is about Jim and Sue, right? And somehow on page 40 of the novel, now we have a different author coming in, and no longer is it those two people, rather it's, Harris and Joan. And where do they come from? Okay. And we see, believe it or not, we see this in papers as well. Not as blatant as an obvious, but different co-authors may have different perceptions of the same core constructs and use them differently, and that confuses the reader. Again, fatal flaw. You want to make sure that the variables that you're using to capture those core constructs really capture the construct in their entirety. That's construct validity. If they only capture a small part of it, then you may need to change your theoretical framing. In terms of that theoretical framing, always are the concerns about underspecification. In other words, you're missing out on a couple of critical paths that should be there. Critical constructs should be part of your model. Overspecification, you've got too many moving parts. It looks like the wiring diagram for a skyscraper. It's not parsimonious. Misspecification, in other words, perhaps you have a relationship going from an X variable to a Y variable, but logically, the Y could be affecting the X as well, right? So that would be an issue of misspecification. Reviewers are always going to be asking themselves these types of questions. These are the easiest ways to ding your paper. And reviewers, unlike editors, are out there to try to find every reason not to publish your paper. Say what you may want to say about reviewers, like they're all out there to be constructive and to help. No, they're all looking to make sure that they preserve their own reputation of not letting garbage get published, okay? The worst thing that can happen to a reviewer when their decision letter is written is you see the editor's comments and the editor is quoting reviewer number 1, the editor is quoting reviewer number 2, your reviewer number 3, and the editor doesn't say anything about your review, right? That makes you look terrible. You never want to be in that situation. So you're always on the outlook or on the lookout for something constructive, ideally, or at least something critical that you can identify that makes the editor think, wow, they saved us. They caught garbage from, they saved us from publishing garbage. So they're always looking, this is the low-hanging fruit. That underspecification, overspecification, misspecification, that along with the disconnect between constructs and variables, that operationalization, disconnection from theory, this is the low-hanging fruit. Once we find these types of things, we typically don't go on to read the methodology even any further. We certainly won't go on to read the results because we don't have any faith in them. Okay. Other things to be thinking about in the theoretical frame. Are you specifying the mechanisms that govern the relationships that you're hypothesizing? Are you testing those mechanisms? If you don't test them, are you at least providing evidence that they're well-established mechanisms that don't need further testing? Can you make counter arguments to your proposed relationships? When might it not work that way? Could a reviewer come back and say, no, I don't buy that argument, right? Or I don't buy the assumption on which you're basing that, right? That's a very narrow assumption. That's not generalizable. And if it's not generalizable, the relevance of your theory is limited, that has limited external validity, we're probably not going to publish it. Then when you look at the hypotheses, could it be any other way? Is it falsifiable? A non-falsifiable hypothesis is essentially tautological. It is true by fact. If something is true by fact, it is anything but interesting, right? It's obvious. We're not going to publish something that's obvious. Remember, we're looking for something that's interesting. So it's got to be logical, but it can't be obvious. It can't be tautological. And then there are other things that we look at in terms of the logic on the theory. You bring in relationships at the individual level, and you assume they operate that way on the aggregate level, the team level, the organizational level. But organizations are not people. This is, you can't anthropomorphize organizations. They don't think. They don't have brains. So what we know about individuals can't necessarily apply to organizations, and vice versa, right? What exists at the aggregate level, you can't necessarily assume happens at the individual level. So here I'm talking about the ecological fallacy and atomistic fallacy. So be careful about your arguments. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm not going to talk about all the methodology and result elements or the discussion. I want to talk, up till now I've been talking about sort of the conventional deductive paper. But I think in Turkey, from my experience, when I was in Istanbul back in September, it was pretty clear to me that a lot of the research that that you do in Turkey, and those of you from other parts of the Middle East, from my observation as well, a lot of that research is grounded more in inductive and abductive reasoning, more qualitative in nature. So I want to talk a little bit about what you need to do to get that type of research published. If you look at Academy of Management Journal, it's at least a third of the articles that are published in Academy of Management Journal are qualitative. And if you look at other top-tier journals like ASQ or Human Relations, again, you'll see a lot of papers that are qualitative. In Discoveries, which again is focusing on observing phenomenon and then generating a plausible theory from those observations, about half of the research that's published in Discoveries is qualitative in nature, right? Is grounded on induction and abduction. So what do we need to do in the framing and the pitch element for those types of papers? And then I'll go on to some elements of the empirical side as well, because with papers using inductive and abductive reasoning, there's a mixture between the theory and the data. You're not testing, but rather generating theory from the data. So the data element is important. But in terms of the pitch itself, you will not be successful in publishing a qualitative paper unless you can make a compelling argument why you went qualitative. What is it about your research question that necessitates a qualitative approach? Because induction and abduction, even in the best written papers, they offer us very, very limited knowledge statements. Think about it. With deductive reasoning, we have a null hypothesis which we either accept or reject, right? We can't come out and say with deductive reasoning, you're either pregnant or you're not. In qualitative research, we can come out and say, okay, you're a little bit pregnant, right? There's lots of room in between. So the knowledge statement is a little bit more limited, right? We're going from the particular to the general, as opposed to deductive reasoning, where we're going from a general principle and showing how it works in particular cases. When it should always work if it's a general principle. If it doesn't, that's a problem, right? With inductive and abductive reasoning, we're going from the particular and coming up with a statement about how the world works more generally. With abductive reasoning, we're making a plausible statement about how the world works. We need to further develop that idea. With inductive reasoning, we're making a fairly, more than just plausible, it's a highly probabilistic statement about how the world works based on specific observations. But generally, we prefer strong knowledge statements. So the only justification really that we have for inductive or abductive reasoning is that the theory isn't there yet to understand whatever it is that we're looking at. We need to generate that theory. It can be mid-range theorizing. We have some sort of basic theoretical framework, but there's some holes. We don't know what the boundary conditions are. We don't understand fully what those mechanisms are that link those two things, even though we've demonstrated that they're linked. This is the basis for looking at the particular and generalizing up to the broader relationship that's underlying inductive and abductive research. And this has to be laid out clearly in the introduction to any type of qualitative study, a study that's focusing on generating theory. If you're trying to test theory, you can do that with certain types of qualitative data, and increasingly with large language models, we're able to do more and more of that. But generally, most of the papers that we use qualitative research for nowadays, still today, is focused more on this inductive and abductive reasoning, and it needs to be justified. So one of the justifications we might give is, like I said, there's no good theory to explain whatever it is that we're seeing. We can explain elements of it with lots of different theories, but there's no overarching theory that really explains these patterns. Second is that the theories that we have to explain these patterns are not very well fitting. They don't do very well. And perhaps by looking at these patterns more closely, we can come up with a better framework for understanding what's involved. So those are compelling arguments, okay? Typically, there's a hunch that you have going into these types of studies, and you've got to lay out what that hunch is and lay out why you're adopting this approach for getting a better sense as to whether that hunch is based on empirical evidence or not. Another key element here is actually how do we collect the data to demonstrate this? So don't confuse the means of data collection for deductive reasoning with those that we use for inductive reasoning. For deductive reasoning, remember, we're starting with a general proposition and testing whether that holds in a particular case. And if we're doing that, we have to take a sample at random from the population that general proposition relates to, right? In abductive and inductive reasoning, we're doing the opposite. We're going from the particular up to the generalizable. So we're not engaged in random sampling. In fact, we're doing quite the opposite. We're doing theoretical sampling, where we are specifically identifying cases that push our boundaries, that test those boundary conditions, that help us understand where things work and where things don't work, okay? So don't confuse the qualitative data with a deductive mindset. If you're going to generate theory based on particular cases, use the theoretical samples, use the multiple samples, and don't be afraid of showing when things don't hold, because that's part of the theory generation process. When does it work or when does it not work is just as important as when it does work, okay? So what I'm trying to express to you is that a lot of this is very, very fluid and dynamic when we're doing inductive or abductive reasoning in those types of papers. We're frequently going back and forth, looking at different explanations. We're collecting data as we're analyzing data. We're adding new variables. We're getting rid of certain constructs. And it's not a binary or definitive approach like we would see in those conventional papers that I was talking about earlier. I think I'm going to stop there so that we can have a few minutes for questions, but I think that gives you sort of a general idea about how to frame your papers and how to pose your pitch in the paper. So let's take the last 5 minutes